Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. Let's talk about review embargoes. That sounds like fun, Daddy! No, it doesn't, does it? It actually sounds really dull. If this channel were one aimed at the lowest common denominator, I imagine most of you would have switched off by now, or probably not clicked the link in the first place. Thankfully, it isn't. So let's talk about something that actually affects the industry, and more importantly, affects you directly as the consumer. This is not just some inside baseball, as they call it in the United States. I'm not really sure what that would be translated to in the UK. Indoor cricket, possibly. A little bit of subterranean rounders. It could be either of those or many more besides. But this is something that directly affects you as the consumer, so you need to know about it as far as I'm concerned going forward. So, I am going to tell you. What is a so-called review embargo? Well, I'm sure that some of you already know, and I'm sure that some of you don't. And I'm sure that some of you think that you know, but maybe you apply too many sinister connotations to it. When some people hear embargo, what they really hear is corporate censorship. They're not 100% wrong, but as usual, when something like this comes from a kernel of truth, it also is embellished to the point of being ridiculous. So what is a review embargo? A review embargo is an agreement between a reviewer, or critic, or YouTuber, or basically any kind of publication, and a publisher or developer that gives them access to what is called a review copy or review code. Now, does this mean you use it to produce a traditional review? Not necessarily. It's the sort of nomenclature that's just used industry-wide because it's convenient. But what it means is early access copy before the game actually comes out. What's the purpose of it? It's to allow you to play it, formulate your opinions, and then release some kind of critical content, whether it be first impressions review, or maybe it's just some kind of fun montage, or even early Let's Play access. Embargo agreements are put on all of these people and more besides. And you might ask, well, what's the reason for that? Why couldn't upon the receipt of a copy you just put out footage immediately, or put out some writing immediately? Well, there's a few reasons for that. The first and least sinister reason is that review embargoes are put in place to allow every outlet an equal chance to get traffic on their review. If there were no review embargo, then what would happen is that these outlets would rush to try and get their review out first. This is particularly pertinent for those that are involved in traditional games press, because a lot of that traffic is going to come from aggregator sites like Reddit, it's going to come from shares on Twitter, it's also going to come from Metacritic. And the people that get the most of those are generally the ones that get their content out first, because of course there is an insatiable desire amongst gamers to acquire information as quickly as possible, and generally they are not massively discerning about where they get it. Now, I'm making a very large generalization here because I know there are plenty of people that only visit certain websites, but on the whole, I would say that most people are willing to go and read a review regardless of what site it's on if it happens to be the first one out, because they're genuinely curious about whether or not this game's actually any good. So if you took review embargoes out of the equation, then sites would rush to make sure that their article or their video was the first one out of the gate. Now, they may adapt that format. They may decide, all right, well, we're not doing a traditional review, we're doing some kind of first impressions, or we're even doing a live stream, and that kind of stuff works pretty damn well. And there's rising popularity for that sort of format. I should know I basically use the first impressions format. Admittedly, I generally spend longer on my videos than other people do when they go for first impressions, and I don't go in blind. But it does mean that I'm able to produce content at a more rapid rate than other people who, when producing a more traditional review, may feel that they have to beat the game in order to do so, or at least put a fairly large number of hours into it. Doesn't necessarily mean that they do, and many reviews are published without any information whatsoever as to whether or not they actually finished the game, or indeed how long they spent on it. Some do, some don't. But you would think that's the traditional expectation when dealing with a traditional review format. And you will probably see sites and YouTubers much more willing to blur the lines, much more willing to slapdash things if they can get it out first, because there's a lot of traffic to be had. Because as I said, a lot of gamers are very impatient when it comes to getting that sort of information. Sites that get that info out first are greatly rewarded. So that's what would happen if you took review embargoes away. Review embargoes in that respect are pro-consumer because they ensure that sites don't have to rush each other in order to get the information out, which means they can spend more time, and in theory that also means that they have a better impression of the title, they know more about it, and they're less inclined to make mistakes. It also means that the editorial process has time to actually work, as opposed to throwing the first thing out on your blog that you possibly can, which is something that a lot of outlets really do a lot of these days, and that results in errors, misinterpretations, or indeed willful clickbaiting. This all sounds fine and dandy, but there is unfortunately a dark side to review embargoes, and we've seen numerous examples, and the most recent has got to be Assassin's Creed Unity. Assassin's Creed Unity's review embargo was set after the release of the game, a full 12 hours after the release of the game. The conditions that you had to agree to in order to gain access to the game early, which frankly you do require if you want to be competitive with other outlets and you want to make sure that you have enough information about the game before you tell your readers and viewers, required said reviewers and YouTubers to stick to a particular reveal date and time. Now, what are the consequences for breaking that? Well, it is a trick that you will only ever perform once. If you break embargo, you are generally not subject to legal action because they are not official contracts. Most of the embargo agreements that I have received are fairly informal. They do not require any degree of signature and probably wouldn't hold up in court. Simultaneously, however, breaking an embargo agreement will result in you being blacklisted by that publisher. They will not send you any more early review code. What does that mean? That means that you are put at a competitive disadvantage to other outlets in the field, and you need to buy your game on launch day. Doesn't sound that bad, you say. You know, why should outlets get their copies for free? Well, frankly, the idea of getting a copy for free isn't really all that important. The idea of getting a copy early so that you can make sure that you can get that information out there before the game is released, that's what's important. If I had to pay for my pre-release copies, I would be more than happy to do so. I'm sure there are some other outlets that would not, but I would be totally fine with it. It's a business expense. It is the cost of doing business. It's totally fine, and sometimes we do have to buy copies because a publisher simply isn't sending any out, such as with Assassin's Creed Rogue, which has apparently had no review copies of any description sent out. None. Zero. It's insane when you think about it, but there are some games where that happens, like, say, Ride to Hell Retribution. And you might be noticing, well, there seems to be a common theme here. You're mentioning games like Assassin's Creed Unity, which has been criticized, and you've also mentioned terrible games like Ride to Hell Retribution. Well, is there a pattern going on here when it comes to punitive embargo agreements? And the answer to that is sometimes yes. Generally speaking, when an embargo is set after the release of a game, it is done so to keep information out of the hands of the consumers for as long as possible. Why? Because it is designed to maximize the number of pre-order and day zero sales that this game receives before the information comes out that maybe, just maybe, in some ways it's actually kind of a stinker. And in the case of Assassin's Creed Unity, while it is not receiving terrible reviews, it's receiving the sort of reviews that if you saw that across the board on a AAA, you would think to yourself, is this actually worth $60? This is hardly the first time that this has occurred. There are plenty of other examples. Games like Aliens Colonial Marines were put in a similar situation. The embargo was set to maximize pre-orders, and why it is a predatory business practice that is inherently anti-consumer. It is about controlling the message. It's about denying information to the customer. It's about denying information to you, the consumer. And if you ever see this happening, you should be immediately suspicious. It does not necessarily mean that every game that has a launch day or post-launch embargo is automatically a stinker, but it does significantly increase the likelihood of that, because you've got to look at the rationale behind setting a launch day embargo. There are only a few reasons to really do this, and one of the only valid reasons is that they're working on the game right up until release, and there's going to be like a day zero patch or something along those lines, which is unfortunately becoming more and more common. The thing is, that doesn't actually work. A lot of the technical problems that are being mentioned in Assassin's Creed Unity reviews are not based on the day one patch, because this is the sort of thing that people will have researched last week when that day one patch wasn't in place. Indeed, if I go and play it right now at the time of recording, Assassin's Creed Unity is still coming up as version 1.1. The 1.2 day one patch is supposed to fix some of these issues, however, it's not out yet. So the review embargo has passed, and the day one patch, which is supposed to fix these problems, which is one of the only valid excuses for delaying the review embargo, isn't there. So ultimately, the review embargo delay was entirely pointless. The real reason why most of these embargoes are delayed is because the publisher does not have confidence in the product. They know that it is not very good. Now, I have seen some publishers make the excuse that they're attempting to avoid spoilers. This is particularly important in very story-heavy games. However, generally speaking, I tend to find that those excuses really don't hold a lot of water, because not only are most outlets going to avoid spoilers because their audience hates it when they spoil the game, but you can also put a clause within the embargo agreement that prevents spoilers in the first place. And I've received some, not many, but some embargo agreements that have respectfully asked me not to reveal certain parts of the plot. And I have no problem doing that. That's absolutely fine. I don't want to spoil the game for my viewers. That would be ridiculous. That's counterproductive. I'll lose my audience if I do that. So it's not as if that stuff's even necessary, but I'll happily abide by it when it's provided, and generally speaking, it's very reasonable. Although there are some embargo agreements that have some fairly unreasonable terms, like say Remember Me, which required you to only use 10 minutes of footage. With that game, I produced a video that was 9 minutes 59 seconds long, and then produced another one after the game had come out when the embargo agreement no longer applied. It was a complete and total waste of everybody's time, and there's no reason to ever put that stuff out there. There are some embargo agreements that have limits on the amount of footage that you can capture. This is often the case with console games, less so with PC, but frankly, those embargo agreements are outdated. They're not the sort of thing that should be used these days because they don't account for long-form critical or let's play style content, which is often equally, if not more valuable to the viewer than your traditional review would be. I'm sorry, but 45 minutes of footage is going to tell me a lot more about a game than 1,000 words will, especially if it happens to be accompanied by some kind of commentary. So, we've established that the likely cause of the post-release review embargo for Assassin's Creed Unity is because the publisher did not have confidence in the game. To contrast this quite nicely, we have the embargo of Dragon Age Inquisition set a week before the release of the title, and it seems like it's getting good reviews across the board. EA and BioWare evidently have the confidence to make that happen. They're not the only publisher to do that, and admittedly, EA has engaged in similar behavior in the past, but evidently, this time around, they were confident in their product. They're certainly not the only company to do this. I've had good experiences in the past with Square Enix when it comes to being able to put out footage without a restrictive embargo. Deep Silver generally lets you do it much earlier than release. Paradox, and a number of other examples. But the thing is, they all tend to vary on a game-by-game basis, and if they think they can eke out a few extra sales by putting restrictive embargoes on games, they will do it. So, is there a solution to this? We've already established that these embargoes are necessary, but simultaneously, when they're placed in an unreasonable time frame, they become anti-consumer. So what can really be done? Well, there's a few things, and it's a fairly complex problem because there is no one-size-fits-all answer. This is a culture within the industry that is enabled by several people. Firstly, of course, it's the publishers setting the embargoes. So we've got to put some blame there. They're also the ones setting the restrictive embargoes, and they're doing it to get extra sales. They are doing it for malicious anti-consumer reasons, and I don't think that can really be understated. It is not that common, but it happens, and quite often it happens on AAA titles that end up not being very good. Secondly, some of the blame has to be put on outlets, and it has to be put on people like me as well, for accepting those embargo agreements in the first place. Now remember what I said, embargoes are necessary to ensure that everybody gets a fair shot, otherwise people would be rushing their stuff out the gate. Now embargoes maybe don't affect me as much as they do traditional games press, because we don't necessarily reliably get copies a week or so before launch. It's nice when we do. We certainly do from indie devs, but we still, after 5 years in this business, have some problems getting copies a decent amount of time in advance before the embargo date. Examples being Assassin's Creed Unity, I got code for that on Monday. There is no way that I would ever have enough time to put out a video by the embargo date. Just not possible. Completely and totally unfeasible. Dragon Age Inquisition. We ran into a problem with the PR company representing EA that told us no copies would be available until the day before launch. Now, after talking to other contacts, we were able to get a copy, and indeed, it turns out the PR company was for some reason mistaken. But again, we got that Monday, a day before the embargo. So, at least in that case, we can get a video out before the game comes out. And that, for me, is fine. I don't really mind hitting the embargo too much. I'll try to when I can, but I'm confident that my audience is willing to wait for my opinion. And as long as I can get the info out before launch, that's good enough for me. That said, we, and that means all of us in games media, whatever role we might take, whether it be traditional games reviewer, whether it be critic pundit, whether it be commentator, let's player, whether it simply be a YouTube guy that just plays games on the internet, when we agree to an embargo agreement, we are to some degree enabling that continued culture. And as we said, that culture can be abused. Can, not always, but can be abused for anti-consumer reasons. What can we do about it? Well, that's where you guys come in. Because I'm not going to blame everybody, but here's the thing. You remember when I said earlier that gamers really, really want the latest and greatest information as quickly as they can? That's why embargoes are so potent. The more people that are willing to wait, the more people who are willing to abstain the pre-order process, the more people that are willing to wait until they have the information before they pull the trigger on a new $60 release, the more power you hand to those who would want to derail the embargo culture, who would want to spend as much time as they feel that they need on a copy that is not restricted in such a way. Now, some people make the argument that receiving a review copy makes you inherently biased. I've said this time and time again, buying a game isn't a big deal. It's the access. It's getting the copy earlier to allow you to create your video or your article that's important. I wouldn't mind paying for it, and frankly, getting a free game is not something that is particularly influential to me in any way. I don't care. It's paperwork at the end of the day. I get loads more video games than I could possibly ever play. I can see that it would be influential to someone that's fairly new to the scene, an enthusiast, an amateur, but to those of us that do this on a daily basis, no. I don't believe that it really has any influence whatsoever. Gifts outside of the copy, absolutely, but a review copy, no. I do not believe that that is influential or creates any sort of bias. And frankly, under FTC regulations, we're required to disclose it anyway, so does it really matter? As far as I'm concerned, no. But the problem is, if we go and buy the game on release just like everybody else, then we are relying on everybody else to wait for our critique. And are they willing to do that? Well, they're being bombarded by pre-release marketing, trailer after trailer after trailer. How many trailers has Far Cry 4 had so far? Huge numbers of them. They're coming out on a weekly basis, for God's sake. A heavily marketed game. A game with pre-order incentives, pre-order bonuses. It's telling you over and over and over and over again, you know what you should do? You should pre-order this game. And then you've got gaming websites that are enabling that by publishing every single bit of news about Far Cry 4, saying, look at this, new trailer from Far Cry 4. We got this bit of information about Far Cry 4. But who consumes that information? Well, the answer is, of course, gamers in general. Why are sites publishing this information? Because it gets read. And this might sound a little bit like blaming consumers. Well, you can't blame consumers as an entity, because that's not fair. Why should people apologize for things they haven't done? If you are someone that waits, if you are someone that does not, in fact, consume all of this pre-release information, if you are someone that does not engage in pre-order culture, you are not to blame for anything, frankly. But you are still being negatively affected by it regardless. Now, I do see a bright future here. Traditional game sites might not, but I do, because I actually do get good views on videos that are very, very late. An example would be Borderlands the pre-sequel. Over 400,000 viewers for a video that came out 2 weeks after the game came out. 2 weeks! People were willing to wait. And I think that YouTube in particular has given an avenue for personality-driven, audience-loyal content that actually may allow us to do something about this whole culture. It may allow us to get over the idea that information has to be put out as soon as possible and that people are completely and totally desperate for it. There is always going to be a market for that kind of stuff. But I think we can create a market as well that runs parallel to it that is more discerning, that is more cautious with its money. Perhaps of people that have been burned one too many times, and I can think of no PC gamer that I know of that hasn't been burned at least once, either by a bad port or just a shoddy game that was drowned in millions of dollars of marketing and not millions of dollars of goddamn QA. I don't think that embargoes have to go. I've explained exactly why they're useful and why they're important, but I think that if there are inherently anti-consumer components to the embargo agreement, we should be disclosing them. We should be telling people what those embargo dates are. Now, you might be saying, well, maybe the embargo agreement says you're not allowed to talk about that. Well, I haven't actually encountered one that has, and whenever I've signed an NDA, it's generally been for something that's been way before release, in pre-alpha state. I don't recall ever signing an NDA for a review copy of a game, ever. The embargo agreement generally does not say that you can't talk about this embargo agreement. You can, and frankly, you should. And I think perhaps it's about time that both YouTubers and traditional gaming media start to disclose embargo dates, because they are pertinent information. They can even be used to drive traffic to a site, because they say, look, our review is going to be out at this time, because that's when the embargo is. So set your watches, this is when you can come and visit us. We could actually benefit from putting this information out there while simultaneously doing a better job to help protect the consumer, because that's our job at the end of the day. And anyone that disagrees with me on that, well, we're going to have stern words. I genuinely believe this. We are in a privileged position where we can protect the consumer. We are in a privileged position where we get our games early and free. We get access that people can only dream of. And we get paid because our viewers watch ads, buy merchandise, and subscribe. That's the sort of thing that we need to always remember whenever we do anything. We are doing it for them. Remember Homer Simpson's workspace? Well, replace do it for her with do it for them. Because consumers are the ones that get screwed over the most when this sort of thing happens. We get our games for free. We don't care if they're bad. It's no skin off our teeth, but I've said it before. Average family gamer, something I talked about a couple of years ago. If average family gamer goes out in his limited free time to spend his limited budget from his job that he hates, but he does it because he loves his family, if he goes out and buys a stinker and we didn't help protect him from that, then whose responsibility is it? Well, there's always going to be an impetus on the consumer to research. But what happens if the only research they can do is directly produced by the company making the game? It's not great, is it? Absolutely not. However, I think we perhaps need to go even further than that, and I'm going to join Stephen Totillo from Kotaku in stating that it will now be Cynical Brit's policy that we will not accept any review copy that happens to have a post-launch embargo date attached to it. Not only that, but I will inform users of whenever I receive information that a game has a post-launch review embargo. Sure, it means that maybe I'm a little bit less competitive, but that particular part of embargo culture is egregious, it's anti-consumer, and we shouldn't be supporting it. So I won't anymore. It's that simple. We need to provide as much information as possible to the consumer and simultaneously encourage responsible purchase habits. Stop pre-ordering video games. Stop relying on Metacritic. Stop relying on information that comes solely from the publisher. Treat everything with skepticism. It's not like you don't have a shed load of reasons to. How many times have you been burned? How many times does a visual downgrade come into effect? How many times has something looked amazing at E3 and then 2 years down the line it comes out and it's little more than average, or worse still, an absolutely unplayable mess? I can imagine you can think of several examples, and that to me is enough reason to be consistently skeptical. Review embargoes are a necessary evil of the industry, but they don't have to be as evil as they are. If YouTubers and traditional games press turn around and say, no, this embargo agreement is completely unreasonable, then publishers are not going to have that many choices left. And if, of course, consumers stand by the outlets they trust and don't simply jump on the first outlet that gets a little sliver of information, then you can declaw the power that publishers have. As it stands, they seem to hold all the cards, but really, that's quite deceptive. I would encourage all my viewers to exercise patience when it comes to this particular industry, because many publishers are engaging in activities that involve simply taking your money before showing you the product. That, to me, is dishonest, and that is not a business model they should be relying on, because it's not sustainable. Jilted customers buy less games. That's bad for the industry. That's bad for everybody involved in it. And by no means should we be engaging in this slash and burn behavior. My name's been TotalBiscuit, and this has been a little bit about review embargoes. I'll see you next time.